I want to say welcome to all of you, and welcome to sunny Phoenix. A little cool this morning, but it beats the heck out of Janesville, Wisconsin, right? Yep. So before we get started real quick, as I mentioned, I'm Gary Jewell. I am technically now a consultant for Legacy Deo. I was Director of Planned Giving for a number of years. Our CEO is in the back, Jerry Kieschnick, his lovely wife, Terry, and our newest appointee to the troop, Jay Brown, Pastor Jay Brown. So we're here. They're here to give me moral support and substitute in when I slip up. So come on in. So just real quick, I'm originally from Central Illinois, spent a lot of time in St. Louis, worked for Southwestern Bell for many years, got an early retirement, did some other consulting and telecommunications. Then I was a Thrivent rep, and then one day a fellow that I know called me and asked if I knew anybody that wanted to become a director of planned giving for a charitable foundation. At the time, and we'll go into this, it was called Lutheran Foundation of Texas, and I felt the hand of God on my shoulder, and I said, well, would you take me? And he said, well, let me think about it. Yes. So, because I've known this fellow for a long time. So anyway, then retired in 2018, and just kind of been doing some consulting and enjoying retirement life. So I have a wife, been married 53 years. We got 5 granddaughters, no grandsons, all daughters, and it's great. Our son lives here in Scottsdale, and so we're staying with them and get a chance to do a little family stuff and be here with you all. So we're really enjoying it and having a great time here. So with that, let's get started making the most of your endowment. Now, so one thing I want to ask is, because I kind of like to get a feel for why you're here, how many of you have organizations that already have an endowment? Anybody? Okay, so a good number of you do. Okay. Well, that's good. I hope you'll find some information that will be helpful. For those of you that are thinking about it, then maybe we'll get some getting started kinds of things out on the table as well. So, first of all, real quick on Legacy Deo. As I mentioned, we used to be Lutheran Foundation of Texas. We were established in 1960 when a gift was made to the Texas district, and it was a piece of real estate, a ranch. And everybody was really excited and said, what do we do with a ranch? So the foundation was formed to handle the sale of the ranch and to get those proceeds coming in, and then it's just kind of progressed from there for the last almost 62 years. We're a 501c3 not-for-profit organization, which means that gifts made through us are made tax-free. No capital gains to worry about, so that's very helpful if you have highly appreciated assets. We did a rebranding process in 2017 because there was a couple things in Lutheran Foundation of Texas that were not real necessarily user-friendly. We figured out, we do work with people other than Lutherans. We don't just work in Texas, and people think foundations are, decisions are made in a dark room with a bunch of old men sitting around in stuffed chairs. So, and that's not what we do. So we rebranded to Legacy Deo in 2017. Our mission is very simple. It's to inspire giving that impacts life forever. That's what we do. So, what exactly does Legacy Deo do? Well, first of all, we are trustee. Depending on the type of financial instrument, we are either a trustee, a manager, a custodian, and/or a manager for over 400 accounts. Those accounts include things like endowment funds, charitable trusts, donor advised funds, and we're going to touch on these a little bit later, not to go into any depth because we want to really talk about endowments, charitable gift annuities, and then congregation and organizational custodial funds. So sometimes organizations have a bunch of money sitting around that's not doing a lot, and we will, as a custodian, manage those funds for them and hopefully get a better return than what they're getting in the bank. So, what else do? We provide estate planning, consultation, and assistance, and you'll find that estate planning is extremely important as people in your congregation decide or trying to figure out what are they going to do with their stuff when the Lord calls them home. Because we all know there's no U-Hauls going to heaven, right? So it's important to get that done. And of course, we specialize in the charitable giving aspect of an overall estate plan. We serve as power of attorney for health care and power of attorney for finance when that's appropriate for individual clients. We serve as executor of individual estates and facilitate special and planned charitable gifts as necessary. The business of serving as executor is kind of interesting. I've been involved with a couple of those recently where people are justifiably asking the question, well, who should I name as my executor? And they start naming people, and pretty soon after discussion they figure out, well, there's somebody may decide not to serve, they may be incapacitated, they may not even, they may be with the Lord by the time that they have to perform that function. So having an institution is helpful because you get continuity. Probably the ones that I've been working on, I won't be around, or at least part of Legacy Deo by the time they need an executor, but there will be somebody who will do that. So that makes it extremely valuable and important. And then we offer educational seminars and presentations. Legacy Deo, so that involves our legacy from God and our legacy to God. So our legacy from God is simply who we are and what we have. Everything we have, we know, is a gift from the Lord. We're here to be stewards of it. And of course, in Psalms it says the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. So that's that was fundamental to our deciding to go with the name Legacy Deo. And then our legacy to God is what we do with who we are and what we have. And so decisions that are made need to be made with that in mind. And sometimes I think people maybe get the idea that folks talking to them about estate planning and charitable giving are, well, I know you only want to leave something to somebody else, and we will quickly say, no, the Bible says anyone who does not provide for their relatives have denied the faith. So important to consider the personal aspect as well as the charitable aspect as people lay out their estate plan. Okay, so with that as background, let's get into some of the fundamentals of endowments. First of all, endowments are designed and exist to exist in perpetuity and provide regular income for projects that are specified in the endowment. So let's talk about that. There are two, I think, general categories of projects. One, it can be very specific. We have some that are for the endowment exists to receive funds to provide income for fellows who are going to go to the seminaries. Because the donor, originally, that's what they wanted to do. That's a pretty specific use of the endowment proceeds. We have some that provide for maintenance of cemeteries. Do any of you go to a church that has a cemetery? Anybody? There are several in Texas, and so maintaining the cemetery sometimes is hard to do, so there's sometimes endowments set up where the proceeds are used just to maintain the cemeteries that have existed with that congregation for a long time. Then on the other side of the spectrum, there are a much more broad use definition of the project. The one I really personally like is where we say that the proceeds from the endowment are going to be used for the special projects of Christian education, mission, and ministry. So that means that the church can decide each year how to use the proceeds from the endowment that fit within those categories. They're not limited to scholarships. They're not limited to just for the music department, even though that's a great thing. I'm a vocalist. I would love it if every endowment had something to the music department. But Christian education, mission, and ministry, broad, and anywhere in between. it's really up to the initial donor working with the congregation to decide how they want the proceeds from their particular endowment to be used. The project is typically defined by the initial donor. So that's characteristic of it. Somebody's got to decide. Now, if the church is initiating their own endowment, then they might form an endowment committee that will decide how they want to use the proceeds from the endowment. The good thing is, once an endowment is established, it's open to receive gifts from any source. Other members of the congregation, not just the initial donor, other members of the congregation, friends of the congregation. It could come from memorial gifts that might be left to deceased loved ones. So many, many different sources for proceeds to the endowment once it's established. The corpus typically remains untouched. That's another characteristic. There are the potential to make exceptions to that, but generally speaking, we encourage the people who are starting endowments to let the corpus remain untouched. The annual value will vary because it's going to depend on what the instruments are that the funds are invested in that underlie the endowment. So I think you can imagine that the underlying value may vary. Okay, so who are typical prospective endowment? By the way, I didn't say this before, I should have. Please ask questions along the way. It's not a lot of fun to sit there and listen to a talking head, and if you have a question, I can guarantee you somebody around you has it. They're not just brave enough to ask. So please ask questions as we go along, and then hopefully there'll still be time at the end for other questions that may pop into your head. So, who are typical prospective endowment donors? Well, I'd say at its root level, typical donors are stewards who have been blessed by a particular church, a ministry within the church, by the school. Maybe it wasn't them. Maybe it's their kids who went to the school or their grandkids who went to the school. But the thing is, they have a reason that they want to remember a certain aspect of their congregation. And so they'll want to leave a legacy, and that's the whole key behind endowments. It could be stewards who understand the impact and benefit of ongoing funding. So they've been donors, regular annual stewards every year. You love them. They love the church. But they want a way to continue to be able to give to their ministry of choice. Endowments give them a great way to do that. This is another good one. Grandparents of stewards who maybe don't necessarily attend the congregation because of just geography. They don't live there, but yet they know their kids have gone to school. I will use a personal example for myself and my wife. We have a granddaughter who has a very rare autoimmune disease, and she was blessed by the Make-A-Wish Foundation. And so, as grandparents, we know what they did for my daughter's family. And so, we have remembered Make-A-Wish in several ways and in our estate plan as well, just because of how our family was blessed. So, grandparents, great sources of at least discussion to find out what might be on their hearts and how they might want to remember the church that has blessed their family. Here's another one that isn't always talked about, but it's a great one to keep in mind. More senior couples with no kiddos. And yet they have the same desire that everyone else does to leave a legacy, leave their mark on something. And so having a discussion with that type, it doesn't have to be a couple, it could be an individual as well, but someone who doesn't have any other place to go to necessarily leave it other than to you know, something that maybe wouldn't make as much sense. So get involved with them, have discussions with them. That's a key thing. So how do you get started? Well, first of all, you got to have an initial exploratory meeting with the prospective donors. Once you've identified this set of people that might be good to talk with, just get a hold of them, have a discussion, sit down and find out what's on their heart, and let them know what you're thinking, and so you can find out what they're thinking, because that's the key thing. What do they want to do? And then you can discuss endowment language and provision. So if there is an existing endowment, you can talk to them about how endowments work, how that it will continue to bless the congregation for a long time after they're gone. Then it's always good to encourage them to review the endowment with their attorney as appropriate. And I'm saying this just because it makes sense, plus from the perspective of the congregation or the organization, it makes sense because you don't want someone to come along later and say that their friend, their family, their grandparent, or whoever it is, was coerced into giving. So take it to the attorney, let the attorney bless it, and say, yeah, this looks legitimate, and then you can feel much better about moving ahead. Now, if you're talking to an initial donor, you don't have an existing endowment, then you want to agree with them on the final language, and that will be things like what project or projects do you want to support? And it could be multiple projects. It doesn't have to be just one. It can be multiple ministries that they may want to bless. There's also, generally the question comes up about continuity. Well, what if this particular organization that I want to benefit doesn't exist by the time it's, they start receiving funds and then they go out of business? What happens? There should be language built into your endowment that says what happens in that case, so that there's no question. Many of the churches that we deal with are in Texas, and so we say that if the congregation doesn't exist, then it would be the organization that may take over that. Maybe it's another church. They combine, and so, Trinity Lutheran and Our Savior Lutheran combine, and it becomes Our Savior, but the endowment was with Trinity. Well, then the proceeds can then go to Our Savior. If they don't want to do that, then you can say, well, then the board of directors of either the district or the foundation will make a decision to assure that the proceeds go to projects that are similarly situated to what was meant to support in the endowment in the first place. So the point is, you've got to build in continuity to take that question off the table. And then there are other more legal things that come up, like the beneficiaries of the endowment have to be certifiable as charitable organizations under the laws of the state of Texas or wherever your state is, and that's just language that we use, and that if you're doing one on your own, you got to make sure that you get the details of the endowment built up by an attorney who knows what they're doing, so that you don't get in trouble later. Then the parties sign the endowment, and that's a very happy moment when that happens, because now they're able to say, I've done it. I've left my legacy. I know what I want to do. Now, here's the other key thing. The donor provides the initial, or what I sometimes call the founding gift. And that should happen at the time that they sign the endowment. Because as a friend of mine said once, if you don't get the money, it's just a hobby. So you don't want to be in the hobby business. You want to be in the business of setting up perpetual endowments for your congregation, and to help your donors leave a legacy that they want to leave. So, questions about that? Does that kind of make sense in terms of steps that you need to take? Okay. Now, how can endowments provide financial support to your organization. Some of this is going to seem pretty fundamental, but thought it would be good to go over some of these things. It does provide supplemental financial support beyond regular stewardship because the transient nature of donors and families. People move. Right, Molly? Mm-hmm. People move. Molly is a fairly recent resident of Colorado. Before that was in Illinois. But, you know, you move. People move. So your donors, that means your donors are moving. They're not going to stay with your congregation for the rest of their life. Praise the Lord if they do. But I'm sure most of you have had situations where donors who were significantly involved go somewhere else. The natural process of illness and aging, that's another way of saying that people die. And so when they die, they don't continue to give. It's unlikely that unless a provision is made in their will or through an endowment or some other financial instrument, that their family who receives their proceeds is going to say, you know, Mom and Dad were given to Trinity Lutheran. I think we'll just give $10,000 a year to Trinity just to remember them. Probably not going to happen. So this is a way, endowments can be a way to help sustain income for your congregation. Changes in members' charitable interests, you know. New things come along, like I mentioned in our case. We weren't supporting Make-A-Wish until our granddaughter was blessed by them, and now we do. Or members, I don't know if you've ever had a member that kind of got in a bad, crossways with the church, and maybe for a while they, you got to follow where their checkbook goes, and their checkbook stopped going to the church. So members' charitable interests change. So, and you can probably think of your own, situations you've seen come up in your congregation. So funding from a $100,000 endowment can typically provide $4,000 to $5,000 annual gift. So if you had a new member coming in and you found out that they give $4,000 to $5,000 a year, most pastors, church leaders would be pretty happy with that. Well, endowments can be a way to be like having another donor sitting in the pew. So financial support from an endowment is very important. It also provides stewards additional options for long-term giving that perhaps they haven't thought about, like through wills and bequests. Endowments, by the way, can be supported through a will or a bequest because you include the endowment as one of the beneficiaries of the will, and people will designate a certain portion or either dollar amount or percent to an endowment. Trusts are another way. Trusts have beneficiaries. Endowment can be the beneficiary of a trust. Ongoing annual gifts or memorial gifts. I mentioned that a few minutes ago, but the old proverbial language, in lieu of flowers. Are any of you florists, by the way? I always hate to do that, but in lieu of flowers, memorial gifts may be given to the Trinity Lutheran Church Mission and Ministry Endowment Fund. It's a great thing to do because then people feel like they're giving to something that is important. And if the family specifies that, the family of a deceased member specifies that, it may be surprising to you, but expect that you will get some significant gifts if you do that. And it helps keep stewardship at the forefront of your ongoing finance. Yes, question.
Just wondering, do you by chance have any statistics relative to those who have an up-and-going endowment for the church as to what percentages come from wills, bequests versus trusts versus annual gifts versus maybe just regular weekly contributions? And do you have any data on where typically those funds come from?
Right, so the question is, do we have any data or statistics on what percentage of gifts to an endowment come from various sources, be they memorial gifts or other types of financial instruments, as opposed to just somebody writes a check, sometime during the year. I don't have that. I don't know if you, Jerry, I don't know if you have any. I would say that the greatest portion comes from other financial instruments or from appreciated assets, not necessarily cash. So, I mean, people do give with cash. Memorial gifts almost always are cash. But, and sometimes people get a bonus and they want to send some of that bonus to the endowment, for example. But a lot of times it's from appreciated assets, and we're going to get into talking about that in just a minute or two. So keep that in mind as we go through the rest, but we don't have any statistics on that. Jerry?
Right, I have no statistics. My gut tells me that the larger gifts that go to endowments probably come from, number one, up there, wills and bequests, or some type of estate planning program or plan. That's where the bulk of people's assets lie, and we need our money while we're still living, right? We don't want to outlive our resources. But when Lord calls us home, we don't need that money anymore. So that's a natural way for people to use the bulk of it. I mean, we're talking larger gifts at that point that people are generally able to make during lifetime. Unless they have the kind of things that Gary was talking about. You got some appreciated assets, all of a sudden you're trying to figure out what in the world to do I don't want to pay this stinking capital gains tax, so you transfer the stocks or the assets to the endowment and no capital gains tax, and plus a nice income tax deduction. So there are lifetime gifts that are really appropriate at certain times in certain situations. The deal is, it all depends on the individual person and family, and what their situation is, and what their desires are, and what their resources look like. That's what makes it so much fun.
Yes, sir.
Do you mind if I throw out some thoughts on that?
Go for it.
So, my background is I was on the endowments committee and kind of helped right the ship at our last church. I'm on our foundation committee now, but my day job, I'm not a church worker, sorry. My wife is, that's why I'm here. But I run a trust department and have for many, many years. We see lots of estate plans that come through and that end up going to various and sundry churches. And I think the answer to his question is, it depends. Are you doing a capital campaign? And if you're doing a capital campaign, you might get a donation of real estate or appreciated stock or appreciated property. I think it depends on the condition of the stock market. I think it depends on, do people even know you have an endowment or a foundation? Because I can assure you, even at our church, which is a fairly large one, there's a whole lot of people that don't, and we're working on that, but I think it's a constant battle to make sure that they do. I think it depends on who's on your endowment committee and who's on your foundation committee, and does your church trust them? A horror story from my last church was we had an estate. The estate was going to leave property to the church. It was, I believe, $69,000, which is a nice amount, not monstrous, but a nice amount. And our treasurer at the time bragged that it was awesome that we got it when we did, because we could use it to pay the heating bill because it was a cold winter in Nebraska. That, of course, went over like a lead balloon. Lots of the older folks in the church had a royal conniption, several of which were folks that I knew and dealt with, and were planning to take the church out of their plans. I went to our board at the time, said, one, that's not what our policies say. They say any gifts of this sort are to go to the endowment. We need to get it fixed. They, of course, said, well, we don't have the money to do that. And they said, you don't have the money not to do that. They got it fixed. They got it over there. We saved those dollars. So 6 years or so later, one of those individuals that was going to pull their estate plan left about $1 million to the church. So, there's a whole lot of things that go into his question, but a lot of them are things that you need to be thinking about on a daily basis, and how your endowment, how your church, how the people that will be giving to you perceive what you're doing and how you're doing it. Because they're watching, whether you think they are or not. They want to know how you're using it. Most people do not want to see their dollars go to paying the heating bill, or paving the parking lot, or putting on a new roof.
Right.
They want to see that you have programs available for your school or for your favorite, or maybe not your favorite, but music, or for certain charities or that the church sponsors or whatever. But they want to see those kind of things. But I'm a firm believer that generally your biggest dollars can come through estate plans and that type of thing. But you got to make sure you're laying the pathway to get folks there
Right.
As you're going along, or you'll never see them later.
Right. Yes, ma'am.
Sorry.
No, no.
I was saying, my church has a 100th anniversary coming up in a year or so. I think this could be a good time to get an endowment fund going.
It's a great time.
Yeah.
Yes.
We're looking back, we're recognizing. Do you have, the Legacy Day, do they have like outlines on how a committee should get started on this?
So the answer is yes. We're going to get to some of that in just a minute, and if we don't exactly the way you want, then let's come back and talk about it. Okay, thank you for that. And you know what you brought up a minute ago about the church you went through. I'm sorry, what's your first name? Okay, so what Brad brought up was something very important about communication within the congregation in all aspects of finance, not just your endowment, but particularly if you have an endowment, keeping people informed of how it's doing, where the funds are coming from, how they're being spent, critical, because it helps build that, what I call the small T trust, so that people can want to participate in the big T trust when the right time comes along. So awareness campaigns are extremely important to keep stewardship at the front of ongoing church life, including an annual endowment emphasis. And so again, what he brought up was that, people in the congregation don't even know the endowment exists. Well, that's got to change, because if you want that endowment to be the sustaining tool that it should be, then there needs to be an endowment emphasis. And it needs to be annual for a couple of reasons. One, because new members come in, right, hopefully to the church over time, and that's a way for them to find out about it. And secondly, people weren't ready to participate last year or the year before that. But now they are. They've had a life event maybe that has caused them to start to think about their overall estate plan and how they're going to what kind of legacy do they want to leave and how are they going to do that. So annual endowment emphasis we think is very important. He also mentioned a capital campaign. Navigating a capital campaign with an endowment emphasis can be done. Talk about communication. This is where it's really important, because people need to understand the difference between the use of funds for capital versus use of funds for endowments. And it's okay to combine those two, but to just know that typically what we've seen is congregations saying, we're going to do a campaign, we're going to add an education wing or whatever they're going to add, 10% or some percent of those proceeds are going to go to our endowment, which will then help support what the use of that educational building is going to be for anyway. So it's just depending on what you want to do and how you want to communicate it. The key thing is to do it very thoughtfully and to think about it ahead of time, what might come out of that, so that you avoid pitfalls and misunderstandings later. Sources of funding. The most common sources of endowment gift funding, first of all, endowments can be either already established or so if they're already established, that means that they're going to come from various sources that we've already talked about. If it's a testamentary endowment, now that's kind of a big $3 word. What that means is it's endowments that are set up at death. That's also very possible and frankly not unusual. People want to support a church and or other endeavors that other charities, but they do it at death because Dr. Kieschnick mentioned that, as people are living, they got to make sure they have the assets available to get income from, but once they're called home, then they can maybe do something with those funds to help fund an endowment. So testamentary endowments are certainly important. The sources, cash equivalents, cash or cash equivalents like an inheritance, a CD rollover, a bonus, that type of thing. Appreciated assets. Okay, we touched on this. Gift of stock. Do not sell the stock before the gift is made, or a gift of real estate. Do not sell the real estate before the gift is made. I intentionally put it up there like that to say, look at what's important. Don't sell the asset before the gift is made, because the donor has to pay the capital gains tax depending on what tax bracket they're in, and generally speaking, people feel like that maybe the capital gains rate that currently exists is going to go up. So you gift the appreciated, so let's say it's to an endowment. If we're the trustee of the endowment, you make the gift through Legacy Deo for benefit of the Trinity Lutheran Church Education, Mission, and Ministry Endowment. Then we can liquidate the asset, no tax. 100% then of the value of that gift goes to the endowment. It doesn't get a haircut because tax had to come out of it. So, very important. We've already mentioned bequests from a will or an estate plan. And as Jerry mentioned, that's probably the primary source that we see coming from wills and estate plans. And so in the will or estate plan, you can people will typically either designate a specific asset perhaps, or a specific dollar amount, or they will designate a percent of the residual estate to go to the endowment. Now there are some lesser known sources of funding, but equally important. Charitable trust or gift annuity. Again, not going to go into a lot of detail here about that. That's kind of a separate course, talking about a charitable remainder unit trust or a charitable gift annuity. But those are important because what they do is provide income to the donor. So mom and dad, grandma and grandpa have some assets. They want some income now, but they want to give the gift eventually to the church or to the endowment of the church. Charitable gift annuity will do that. It'll pay them 5% income year after year after year until both of them are called to heaven. Then the remainder, if it's a unit trust, it can actually go to their kids for another 10 or 15 or 20 years. Then it can eventually go to the church. So a great tool to use. Again, not going to go into a lot of detail. There is a brochure that we have over here. We got 3 different brochures over here if you want to pick one up, that has a little bit more detail about charitable trust or charitable gift annuity. Donor advised fund. Again, not a lot of detail, but it's a way if someone gets a big increase in income, which can happen through a bonus, for example, increase in taxable income. They can set up a donor advised fund, which allows them to designate that whatever they put in the donor advised fund is going to go to charity, but they may not know which charity they want to give it to right now. They can still get a tax deduction in the current year for that gift to the donor advised fund, and then decide 2 years from now what charity that they want to benefit. So it's a neat way to let somebody offset the otherwise tax impact of the big increase in income, but not decide until later what charity or charities that they want to benefit. Beneficiary designations. These are also huge because life insurance policies, retirement plans, and IRAs, those all have beneficiary designations that are effective outside of the scope of a will or of the estate plan. So if somebody thinks they're going to give their IRA to somebody and they put it in the estate plan, they forgot that the IRA has its own beneficiary. So by the time they get to that point, they're going to be disappointed, or the beneficiary is going to be disappointed. So beneficiary designations are significant and very important. If somebody wants to designate an endowment as a 25% recipient of their life insurance policy, just contact the insurance company, get a new beneficiary form, write down whatever percentage of that life insurance policy or whatever dollar amount of the life insurance policy they want to go to the endowment. Get it changed, and then it will work. Otherwise, it won't. Now, IRAs are kind of their own special course. I'm not going to give you the details on this. We're not going to get into the weeds too far, but understand they can be an end-of-life gift through the beneficiary designation, like we just talked about, or more importantly now, for people who are taking their required minimum distribution, the RMD. I like to call it a mandatory distribution because IRS says if you're, now it really only applies over 72, even if you don't need the money, Grandma and Grandpa, you've got to take a distribution from your IRA. It's the law. So, what they can do, if they're charitably minded anyway, and they don't need the income, or they don't need all the income, it doesn't have to be 100%, it can be whatever amount they want it to be, they can do what's called a, again, I hate the details, but you got to understand what to ask about. They can do a qualified charitable distribution, or known as a QCD. And what that does is it allows them, the owner of the IRA, to send part of their required or their mandatory distribution directly from the trustee of the IRA to a charity that they designate. It doesn't pass through them at all. And so that means that they don't have to claim it as income on their 1040 form when they fill it out at the end of the year. And why is that important? Well, because now that the standard deduction on tax forms is $25,000 plus, I don't try to keep track of what the individual amount is, but and for seniors it's more like $27,000 or $28,000. Unless they have deductions that exceed that, they don't get to take it on their 1040 form the way they used to. But if they don't do a QCD, if they take the distribution, they still got to claim it on their tax form, which means they'll be paying taxes on it before they give it to the charity. So not a happy event. Yes, ma'am. Did you have a question?
No.
Okay.
I do.
Oh, okay.
So basically, if they take an RMD, they're going to get a 1099.
Yes.
If
That
they
is
don't-
correct.
If they don't do the QCD.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, they're going to get a 1099 either way. Okay. So the question is, if they take an RMD, they're going to get a 1099 from whoever the trustee is of their IRA. That is true. It's up to the individual to keep track of when they make the QCD, and there's a place on the 1040 form to designate how much of that RMD that they got really went to a nonprofit or a 501c3. And you just have to keep records of that, and you can get records from your trustee so that in case you're ever audited, if IRS comes and knocks on your door, you can say, yeah, I've got the backup for that. Please go away. So, yes.
Just backing up a second, just reminded me when you talked about the itemized deductions. We've seen a number of people utilize the donor advised fund, not because they got a big bonus check or a big sale of something, but as they retired, have a house paid for, so they have no interest to deduct on itemized. Their medical insurance, they don't have that anymore to deduct on their itemized.
Right.
So they'll go in and say, I'm going to contribute 50 or 75,000 donor advised fund, write it off this year, and then just take the standard deduction for the next 2 or 3 years until they need to do it again. So we've seen a few people utilize that. I know it's not with the endowment part, but it's been a pretty good tax strategy for a number of people.
It is a good tax strategy, and it could be for the endowment because they could always designate the endowment as a recipient of the distribution from the donor advised fund 2 or 3 years later. So all a good thing. Or maybe the endowment will come along later and it wasn't even in existence when they made that gift, but now it comes along and they say, hey, that's great. So yes, but thank you. That's a very good tax strategy to use. So again, Not trying to get into the weeds on this today, but wanted to make you aware of, yes,
Again, from my day job, I can't emphasize enough how important it is that somebody with your church or your endowment, and you probably have a CPA of some sort of your church, understands the IRA provisions.
Yes.
Lots and lots and lots and lots of my clients are giving away part or most of their IRA, previously RMDs, now as QCDs. Even those, excuse me guys, little old ladies, mostly because they outlive us little old guys, that are used to giving a church check every Sunday, when you explain to them that they don't have to pay tax on it, they also hate paying taxes, they love doing this, and then we also talk to them about the fact that you aren't using it, you don't need it, and if it eventually goes to your kids are gonna get somewhere between 40 and 70 cents on the dollar because of taxes, especially if there's estate taxes involved. And if you're charitably inclined, one of the best assets to give to a charity or to your church foundation or endowment is your IRA. So
absolutely.
it's a great entree point where you can save them taxes now, they like you then, and maybe it's going just directly to your church at first, but it's a great way to fund your endowment long term.
Yes, yeah, Molly.
My day job is a retirement plan administrator, and especially for business owners or those working past 72 now, they want to do that, but that rule doesn't exist if it's an employer-sponsored plan. So also advising, especially the business owners, if they have the ability to do a rollover into the IRA, then they get that tax advantage that's not there
Yep.
in the retirement plan of a
Yep.
company.
And
Yeah.
they can do up to $100,000 a year.
Yes, thank you for mentioning that limit. There is a limitation, but it's also a good thing, because an RMD has to be an IRA has to be pretty substantial to have a $100,000 mandatory distribution, but there are plenty of people that have those that have more than that. So up to $100,000 can pass through a QCD to a charity or multiple charities. So yeah, very, very good thing. And so what Molly brought up is kind of important, because occasionally we get questions about people say, well, I have a 401k and it's been with my employer and it's still sitting there. Should I roll it to an IRA? And to me, the answer is always yes, because then you have more flexibility of what you can do with it. And you can also better control the investment that 401k is in, because sometimes it's in employer stock. And maybe you work for Enron, in which case that wouldn't be a good thing. So anyway, yes, Brett.
I think that's a tougher question than what you just made it. Number one, their fees are probably less in the retirement plan than they are going to be in most other outside IRAs. So you have to be very careful with that when you advise them. They can roll out, as you suggested, a portion to allow for the QCDs and the like. There are also new rules going into effect that anybody in this business hates, that is going to require you to actually figure out and divulge what the fees are now, what your fees will be, and it's a disaster. Great intent, horrible rule. So anybody that's in the business has to actually take the next step and analyze that. So
Good
I
point.
don't necessarily disagree with you, but I would, it's a little more complicated
I got you.
than that.
Yep.
So.
Okay, thanks for that clarification. Yes.
Just a comment, this is all good stuff. I'm on the Endowment Fund committee at our church, and sometimes the challenge is, how do you get this information to people, and how do you explain it to people? You know, because the annual church meeting is not the time to do this,
No.
right?
No.
And yet you bring it up, and all of a sudden a bunch of hands go, no. And we're just a bunch of volunteers, and we don't have the expertise that maybe some people like you have, so it's like, we know it's a great vehicle, but sometimes the challenge is, okay, you share that thought, but now how the devil's in the details of how do you get a person to do it?
It is. It is. And in fact, that also is coming up on a slide, but the answer to me almost always is it's got to be more personal. It's got to be more one-on-one, because everybody's situation is different. And what applies to one person may not apply to another. And so then you're throwing out general information, and people's eyes get what I always call the donut look when they glaze over, see glazed donuts. Anyway.
So one of the
Okay.
answers, we have a member of our congregation that's actually employed by the Little Church Foundation, so.
Oh, well, there you go.
Send Julie in there and say, okay, go get them.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. Raising awareness, and this has come up several times. in the course of our discussion this morning. So how do you raise awareness? Well, first of all, we think it's important to establish and maintain congregational involvement. So there's ownership of the endowment at the congregational level. It's not just something that, we do manage endowment funds through a third party, but it's the congregation's money. It's the congregation's endowment. So they minimally need to have a point of focus within the congregation that's responsible for receiving the distributions, for receiving the reports that we send out, so that they in turn can go back and communicate with their congregation about the status of their endowment, what's happening with it, where the distributions have gone, and so forth. So progress reporting, investment oversight. Now, not necessarily investment management. And why do I say that? Because we've had, and I think somebody back over here alluded to this a little while ago, where you have someone, so you have an endowment committee. So let's assume the church has established an endowment committee and they want to manage the funds in the endowment. And that's well and good if a couple of things are happening. One is that wherever they're putting it is in a place that makes sense for the type of financial instrument that we're talking about here, the endowment. And then secondly, that is typically going up in value, and the person who's overseeing that, because a lot of times it's one person or maybe two who have done investing in the past, maybe they're a broker or an attorney or a CFP or whatever they might be. It's fine, well and good if they're there, but if they leave, all of a sudden then the endowment committee is going, what the heck do we do now, because we lost our expertise. So that's the reason I say not necessarily investment management, because we've seen good cases of that and some not so good cases of that. So it's a decision that needs to be really explored and talked about within the confines of the organization. Regular congregational awareness process, publish articles about the endowment through your website, newsletters, emails, however you communicate and however your congregational members are used to receiving that information. That's how to do that. Report at the regular voters meetings too. I mean, I don't know what percentage of your voters come to your voters meetings. It's probably not a large amount. But then there's minutes that come out about that, and so you can then get that into the minutes, and other people get that on distribution, and maybe you get it out to more people. A key thing to me is success stories. That it's ideal if someone is willing to stand up and say, here's a success story from the endowment. Here's something how I was blessed, or my family was blessed, or I'm the Sunday school superintendent and we were blessed because we got new material from the endowment. We got the funds to buy it, and we wouldn't have had that money if it hadn't come from the endowment. So success stories, heartstring stories, those are extremely important in terms of your overall communication and awareness. Make sense? Any questions about that? Okay, more things about awareness. So you need to develop some written awareness information. What do I mean by that? An overview brochure. Not the ultimate solution, but it's especially useful when the endowment starts, and then as new people come in. You've got a brochure that's available. You can say, hey, we've got this endowment. You might want to read this. And make it crisp and short and not a lot of technical language, but at least people know why the endowment exists and what are the ways that they can participate. A one-page summary document, sometimes those are valuable too. If you got a rack in your church, where you have different types of brochures, just do a short trifold size document, put it in there that summarizes what the endowment's about. Have a specific link on your website that goes to another site that has more detail about the endowment. So if somebody wants to click on that, they can find out about it and maybe put in that somebody to talk to in the congregation. Who do I call? How do I get more information about this endowment? Here's another option that, and I do say in here somewhere that this isn't for every organization, but it does have some appeal, and that is establishing a legacy society to honor and recognize legacy or estate gifts. It's a way that people can feel good about getting on board with a legacy gift. I'm not talking about a weekly gift that goes in the collection plate. I'm talking about a legacy gift that they specifically left through a will or estate plan of some type, a trust, whatever it might be. I'm going to remember this congregation, and I hope you do too, kind of thing. Any legacy gift can become part of the legacy society. Individual gift size remains undisclosed. You know, people aren't going to say how much they put in. Nobody really wants to do that. That's fine. And that's not the point. The point is you're letting people in the congregation know that, hey, if I give that gift, I'm like a lot of other people who are in this congregation already who are giving in this fashion. Now, as I said, it may not be a solution for every congregation, but I think it's something that your endowment committee and eventually your leadership team should discuss. If you have an endowment, do we want to establish a legacy society? And we can give you more detail about that if you want to get it. And so, what's that?
I have a question.
Yeah.
That's kind of, that fits in with this. So I'm also on the endowment board of a camp, Lutheran camp in northern Michigan.
Okay.
We do have a legacy builder society, so people declare their intent to give. And we're toying around with the idea of, is it appropriate to ask for, I guess, call it a letter of intent? Because people will say, I'm going to give your beneficiary life insurance policy. And that's all they say. So we're toying with the idea of saying, greatly appreciate it. Is that life insurance policy $10,000 or $1 million?
Yeah.
Is that appropriate to ask those questions? And then what do you do with the information?
Yeah, well.
Who has access to it? I mean, it's like some people said, well, if they give a percentage of their estate, well, tell me, or your net worth, tell me what your net worth is, you know.
Yeah, I know.
Now everyone knows that Charlie's worth $2 million, you know.
Right. So, first of all, I think that it's good for the church to have an idea from a future plan, or in this case, the camp, have an idea from a future planning standpoint what's kind of in the pipeline. And, you know, I like to refer to the pipeline because we're in Texas and it's an oil business and, you know, anyway. But what's in the pipeline is important for the organization to know. So I don't think that there's anything inappropriate about that as long as you've taken that next step, which you just referred to, which is, and here's how that information will be used. It's a very closed set of people. And by the way, if you want to give us a range, that's fine. You know, if it's 10 to 50,000 or whatever it is, a range is better than not knowing, because now you know that something's in the pipeline. And in terms of a letter, I don't know, Jerry, how you feel about this, but I would rather, once I get that information, I think I'd rather send that back to the donor and say, here's what I understand that we talked about, rather than forcing them, so to speak, to write something to you. So just encapsulate it and send it back to them. And again, reassure them that this is stuck in the, in the vault somewhere in a dusty corner. That
And clearly it's all voluntary.
and clearly it's voluntary, of course. Any gift of any size is a blessing, and you don't have to let us know if you don't want to. Yeah.
So you would say that's a best practice?
Mm-hmm. I would. Do you?
Yeah, it's a tricky deal.
It is.
Because it depends on what the nature of the gift is. A percentage of the life insurance policy, and the endowment is named as the beneficiary. Well, that's pretty good, but the donor can always change that beneficiary
Sure.
designation. So if you want to really get serious numbers, it really needs to be in the form of irrevocable gift. And that's where we get into the charitable remainder unit trust, which is irrevocable. You don't change those. But anything else that might be forthcoming to be designated in a letter of intent is subject to whether that money's still there when George and Martha go to heaven or not. So.
Well, my net worth might be $1 million today, but when I die, it's worth $50,000.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
You know, the whole issue of, does the family know about this? Do the kids know about this letter of intent? And is the letter of intent seen by the children as irrevocable, and that's what mom and dad wanted, and Mike Cracky, that's what we're gonna do? Or are they gonna say, mom and dad were influenced by that guy who's on the board? He's a schmoozer. He came in there and talked to my poor old mother and daddy and got a letter of intent. We're gonna challenge that. So it's a sticky deal.
You gotta be careful.
And your point is well taken. If you do that kind of thing, then you really gotta be careful about saying, would it be acceptable to you to give us an indication of what your intent might be monetarily? And then have a clear understanding whether that's irrevocable or not.
Yeah.
Brad, did I answer that question correctly?
I would, on the Legacy Society, we're in the process of actually starting one, and it's an interesting debate, but I would set some sort of a minimum to get into the Legacy Society. It doesn't have to be very high, but you don't want somebody to give you $100 and then get into the Legacy Society. Regarding the letter of intent, I've seen them done. Some of them done right are even legally enforceable. As a church, you have to determine whether you would want to enforce it. And your answer is no, especially if the family still goes there and that kind of thing, number one. Number two, personally, I've never signed one, so I'd be very careful asking for one. But I do think it's entirely appropriate to ask for ranges. I don't need to know exactly what it is. We don't know what it's going to look like later, but can you give us an idea of this life insurance policy? Is it, I think your number was 10 to 50, 50 to 100, greater than that. Just so you have some ballpark.
Right.
Yeah, it seems a little bit invasive, doesn't it?
But you have to, you have to build that trust, and you need to be able to ask some of that, because you got to figure out whether you're having any success or not.
Right.
Too.
Exactly.
But I like his idea of maybe sending something back. You also have to make sure it's that back to the groundwork. You have to make sure that they understand it is completely confidential.
Right.
And your boards are interesting too, because some want to know everything and some don't understand that some of it's got to be confidential, and they got to keep it that way.
Yep. Okay, so the last thing on this subject that I wanted to bring up here is just a reference to the parable of rich fool. I'm sure you know about the parable of rich fool in Luke, where this person says, "Hey, I'm having a good crop, and I'm going to save all my. In fact, I'm going to build bigger barns, and I'm going to put more grain into my barn." And the Lord comes back and says, "You fool! Tonight, your life will be demanded of you. Now, who is going to get what you have laid up?" So that's just something to maybe keep in mind as an arrow in the quiver, as a way to talk to people about this, that this is biblical. So we're not just doing this because the congregation wants to, put stuff in the barn. This is biblical. And then 2 Corinthians 9:7, the Lord loves a cheerful giver. Everybody needs to know that. I have found over time, though, that he will accept from a grouch. So I'm just saying. So there was an earlier question about how do you kind of make all this happen, and is it the right thing to do? And so right now, many churches and organizations are not equipped to do this work. So you've got to consider how to best make an endowment work for you. It's not something you just dive into and then go, it's kind of like the dog chasing the bus, right? Now that I caught the bus, what am I going to do with it? So you gotta know what you're going to do with it. So I'm going to take a couple of minutes, and we've still got a little bit of time. This will probably be as close to any marketing that I'm going to try to do today, but in the vernacular of considering how to do investing, etc., regarding charitable funds, there are investment consultants or advisors, and there are investment managers. We at Legacy Deo use an investment consultant because what their role is, they get with they're our teammate, they're our valued partner. They know pretty much from the inside out what we're all about as a foundation. How much money do we need to distribute annually? How much can we keep for the longer term? Because we got some things that distribute monthly, some things distribute quarterly, semi, or annual. That's a little different kind of investing than it is if it's a down the road kind of thing. So Greystone, we selected after an extensive search that took quite a few months. They are a business of Morgan Stanley. They have a lot of institutional consulting assets. They have access to the Morgan Stanley Global Investment Committee. They are a fiduciary in their role. That means that they put our interests first. And our relationship with them began 1/1/18. Their current asset allocation looks like that. Not to go into the details, but you know, the assets are kind of split between domestic equities, international, alternative investments that are designed to kind of perform contrary to the market, domestic fixed income, and cash equivalents. That's the investment consultant. Our own particular portfolio structure looks very similar to that. Our total investment assets right now are about $55 million, somewhere in that neighborhood. And so that's the dollar amounts that we have split amongst those different categories. Our return in 2021 was 8%. The 3-year annualized is 12.7. Since we've been in business with Greystone, it's 8.7, and the benchmark that is kind of a combo benchmark that we worked up in consultation with Greystone is 7.6. So that's our oversight of Greystone, because they're our consultant. They're not our managers, because these funds, the dollars, are with individual different money managers that Greystone has as part of their covey of managers that they want to use. And so overall, it looks to us like they're doing a pretty good job. And so that's our story with Greystone. Here's our fee structure. This is available on the website. It's a sliding scale kind of fee structure, so if the investment is less than $25,000, it has a 1.5% fee. The next 25 to 75 is at 1.2. The next 75 to $1 million is 1. So, for example, a $500,000 endowment has a 1.05% annual fee. And I put that up there because somebody here in this group is wondering, well, how do they get paid? So that's how we get paid. I don't have any cards. So,
You'll have some shortly.
going to have some shortly. Mr. J is going to go to the booth and get some. So here's our contact information. Mine specifically, GaryJ@LegacyDeo.org. That's my mobile number. There's also the website. You can send an email to info@LegacyDeo.org, and that gets to the appropriate people within the organization. We are located on East Highway 290 in Austin, Texas, and there's our telephone numbers, contact numbers. So, and there's some brochures over here and a couple business cards if you want those. Yes.
I think you guys would have the information for the detail, but the speaker I heard the last year talked about, I don't remember the number, how many trillions of dollars in this country wealth transfer is going to take place in the next 20 years because of our age group. And if we don't help those people, help them decide what they want to do with that wealth.
Yes.
there's a lot of charities aren't gonna become the benefactors of that. I think a lot of people out there are willing, but nobody's sat down and told them how or why, or hey, here's some great options where you can still take care of your family and take care of it. So that's the thing that really came through me. If we don't get at this now,
Jay,
tens of millions of dollars every day are being,
just one.
some of them are being probably wasted because they're going to pay taxes and things
You're-
like that.
Yep.
So
You're
that one really hit me because the number was astronomical.
Oh, 20, so it depends on who you talk to and what algorithms are using and so, but it's like, well, first of all, as an engineer, I would say it's 10 to the big one. That's my, but it's somewhere in the 20 to at least 40 trillion range, or 30 to 50 with a T trillion dollars of assets that are going to move from the greatest generation and then the baby boom generation to the younger generations. That is going to happen. There are 10,000 people a day turning 65 because of the baby boom, and that's what's happening. So I agree with you totally. I mean, putting it around on a kind of on a more of a positive thought is that if your charitable organization and all the charitable organizations that look like you want to be able to participate in some small way in that 30 to 50 trillion dollars, then doing something like an endowment and becoming more specific about the generosity process within your organization makes total sense, because I agree, it's going to go somewhere. You know, like we say, no U-Haul's going to heaven. So making that decision and deciding how to manage that within your organization is just mandatory if you want to participate in that 30 to 50 trillion dollars. Yes, ma'am.
Do you ever think of expanding across the country more? Because I just feel like in the Atlantic District, we desperately need something like this.
Yeah.
Nothing like this.
Take it away.
Jerry,
May I answer that question? First of all, the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod has its own foundation, LCMS Foundation, which is a wonderful organization that serves the entire nation. So you're certainly welcome to contact them for assistance. Secondly, one of the reasons that we rebranded from Lutheran Foundation of Texas to Legacy Deo was exactly for that purpose. Because we do get requests from people across our nation who for some reason know about us and are interested in the service of a smaller organization, maybe be able to provide a little bit different level of service. So we do that. We're actually in dialogue with a district. It's a separate foundation. It's owned and operated by the district, and foundation is ready to close up shop. They don't have really anybody to do the nitty-gritty work that needs to be done to run a foundation. You don't do it out of your hip pocket. It takes some expertise and it takes some professional management. So we're talking with them. They contacted us and said, we're fixing to go out of business if you take over the endowments and the trust that we have. So we're talking to them about that possibility. We do have the capability also of just on one-on-one, speaking with individual congregations or individual people about their gift plan and about their endowment. You were talking a while ago, 100th anniversary, ideal time to kick off an endowment. It doesn't just happen. You don't just announce, we have an endowment, y'all come. There's some planning needs to go into it, and there's some details, and it needs to be a committee, a small group of people who are interested in getting this thing started and who are willing to go through the educational process or to share what they already know. If they have a grad in their congregation, get the grad in there and tell them what it's all about.
Can they reach out to you,
Absolutely.
all of the committee?
Absolutely. I think I happen to know you, Carol.
I do, I do.
Happy to work.
Yeah.
So it's an important thing that has to be done carefully, because you really only have one chance. If you mess it up the first time around, it's hard to come back a second time. So you gotta do it right the first time.
Right.
It takes some planning, some communication, some coordination. You gotta have pastor on board, you gotta have leaders of the congregation on board. It's a process. Let me tell you just one more story right quick. It goes beyond just the concept of endowments. The true story, I'll change the names to protect the innocent, but I gave a presentation like Gary, who wasn't nearly as good as Gary's. Gary did a great job. Thank you, Gary. But I gave a presentation, and these two people contacted me. They had just gotten married. George was 80 when he got married for the first time. And Martha was 82. She had been married before, but her first husband passed away. So they wanted to visit with me to talk about how they should deal with the fact they've got two estates, his and hers. And they love each other. They're madly in love with each other. It's really cute couple. So the bottom line is, since George had no children, because he only got married to Martha at 80 years of age, and she was 82, she was not like Sarah, or like those kinds of people. So we met, and the bottom line is, Martha's problem was she had two children from her previous marriage, and she wanted to be sure that she somehow or other took care of them or acknowledged their existence. But she didn't know how to do it because the one child was an attorney, a daughter who was very successful, had more money than Martha had. And the other one was a military disabled veteran, a little bit younger, in his 60s. And he gets income from the federal government, from disability and from Social Security, etc. But he's not a good manager of that money. And he's calling Mother Martha every month saying, well, I might need another $500. So Martha says, what happens when I'm not here? What happens to my son and his needs? So we met at their invitation, I went with them to their lawyer, Sarah was her name. And Sarah asked me the question. She said, Martha told me when we first met that she's not sure she wants to leave her daughter or anything. What do you think about that, Dr. Keishnick? I said, well, I've already told Martha to answer the question, but I'll tell it again. I think it'd be a mistake not to include the daughter in your will, Martha, and your wife. Because when your daughter gets that will and looks at it when you're dead and gone, she said, I thought my mother loved me. And she didn't give me anything. Now, I said, Martha, your daughter's a smart lady. She'll figure it out. She doesn't need that money when you leave it to her. She'll give it away, or she'll manage it and maybe help her brother with it. You never know, but she'll figure it out. But at least she'll know, my mother did love me, and she left me a night. I said, I think it needs to be something that's significant. That's $1.50. It needs to be more than that. And then the attorney said, what do you think, Martha? And Martha said, I like that idea. I think that's good. So then the question was how to deal with the son, the disabled son. And I said, I'm going to turn to you, Sarah. I think you probably know better than I do how that should work. And so she said, let's do this. Let's set up a special needs trust in Martha's will. And here's how it will work. When you die, $100,000 from your estate will go into this trust. Legacy Dale will be the trustee. And when the son runs out of money and you're not there to call, they'll call Legacy Dale. And Legacy Dale will say, so what do you need? And what's the expenditure? What's the cost going to be? And is it covered by funding that you're already receiving from other sources? And so then there's no need to dip into this trust. If it's not covered by those sources, if it's a legitimate expense, sure, we'll write you a check and we'll help you make that purchase for this expenditure. And then if there's anything left over after this man passes away, the son, then what's left of that trust fund goes into an endowment fund that George and Martha had provided for in their last will and testament. They don't have it started yet, but they've got money set aside when they both pass away. In addition to the gifts to the two children, they're going to start an endowment fund that benefits their congregation and some other ministries that they love. So the whole idea here is, what do? We try to add value to people's lives. And we try to help them say, everybody's got circumstances and situations. They're all different. That's what makes it so much fun. And so meaningful and fulfilling, because we're trying to help people figure out what's best for their family. They're good stewards. That passage about taking care of your relatives is serious. But we also help them fulfill their charitable intent, because a lot of people just love the Lord. And they love the church, and they want to support the Lord and the Lord's ministry. So it's a cool deal. That's not a professional way to...
It's a technical term, though, technical term.
But anyway, thanks for the opportunity to share those things. And thanks for your attention to this. Man is a very sharp guy. He's got all those letters behind his name.
Whatever they mean. So, thank you, Dr. Keishnick. We do have some of these response forms on the table over here. Another way info@legacydeo.org. You can use my email address here. Here's the 800 number and the regular old Austin number to the foundation. So, yes.
So, a little bit new on the Legacy Endowment Fund picture, but so Keachnick mentioned that you're smaller and level of service might be different, but I'm only aware of the LCMS Foundation and now you guys. So could you maybe just add a little color as to why a church may think of your services versus what the foundation, the LCMS Foundation might be able to do, and what's different? Or you parallel, running the same product and services, but being new,
Yep, I understand. Jerry, I hate to do this to you, but I would feel more comfortable if you would address that, because
As I said,
I'm just a consultant,
we love the LCMS Foundation. I used to be the president of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, for crying out loud. So I'm not going to say that the LCMS Foundation is no good, just forget about them, come see us. David Fiedler is the president of the foundation. This spring used to work for me, he's a great guy. We're on the phone from time to time. And they have wonderful representatives. So there's no reason you should consider LCMS Foundation. Legacy Dale is a small operation. We manage, Gary mentioned $55 million that Greystone manages. We have about $7 million more that's invested in other places because people said, we don't want to just be pooled in everybody else. We want you to invest with Thrive In, for example, or whatever. So we work with organizations and people to try to find out what their heart's desire is, and to the extent that we can do it responsibly and professionally, then we'll honor those requests. We also are we're more flexible in terms of the required minimums. For example, in endowment, we require $10,000. I believe LCMS Foundation requires more than that. And the last time I talked with David Fiedler, he said they were going to raise their minimums. I don't know what those numbers are right now. For a charitable remainder unit trust, we require $25,000. What does your trust require for a
Your minimums are too low.
Yeah.
Bluntly, they're not making any money at that level.
That's correct. But again, that's a service we try to provide, because the next step after a congregation starts in a $10,000 endowment is to say, now what are you going to do to build that endowment? And that's where we can come in also and help a congregation figure it out. We worked with a congregation, I guess I can say this here, of the LCMC. It's not the LCMS, LCMC, which is the conservative people that led the LCA. Yeah, I happen to know very well. A man is a leader of that congregation. So we started that endowment, and Roger said to me, how are we going to build this thing? I said, we can help you do that. So we put together a program. We have we call it a legacy giving campaign. We spend a year with a congregation. And we do some stuff like I mentioned a while ago. We get a committee together, we talk about what estate planning, plan giving is all about, what endowments are all about, and here's some steps that need to be taken to be sure that this process works and the endowment grows. And part of it is to get this small group of people to commit to making gifts themselves, and then to be those spokesmen and women, those the success stories that Gary mentioned, share the experience. So people, you trust people that you know and love in your congregation. What do you know about people that come in from the outside? So if you get people in the congregation to go through a process, they are the best advocates for the process of building that endowment. So that's the kind of stuff we do. And again, the Sins Foundation may do something like that, but the minimums are too low for us. We do have easier ways to get started.
You're betting on the company.
I'm sorry?
Yeah.
You're betting on the business.
Betting on the business.
Yeah. And we want to be able to benefit organizations like yours that we don't want that to be a barrier to entry for you getting into it. We want it to be an encouragement that says, y'all come.
Well, you're not like a regular for-profit trust department that's got to make a return on every dollar
Exactly.
right off the bat.
Right.
Too. You guys you're there to help people You're gonna take something like that to?
We're from Austin, we're here to help.
One more uniqueness, I'm not sure if the Simmons Foundation does this or not, but if there's a donor in a congregation who has specific questions about a specific asset that's maybe above our pay grade, Greystone representatives will communicate with that donor and help that donor figure out what's the best way
Yeah.
to proceed. So we've got that ability as well.
Yes, Brad.
So to be real clear, I don't know these folks from Adams, first time I've met any of them, but their fees are reasonable. And, you know, their minimums are too low. But the gist of that is if you don't have a foundation, you gotta have somebody help you get it started that knows what they're doing. So, and I also like the LCMS Foundation, so, I mean,
Sure.
personally, I talk to both, see where you fit and that kind of thing and
Very
all
good.
that. The other thing, and since many of you are probably board members, you may or may not like to hear this, but the thing that I'm a big proponent of for our church foundation board and for the other I'm on, is make sure that you're getting on those boards the right people, that you're not just doing what most churches are infamous for, which is, let's find the person that doesn't say no very easily, and let's put them on the board, and let's put Ethel on, and let's put John on, and let's put Ruth on, and they don't know anything about foundations, and they don't know anything about fundraising, and they don't want to ask their friends about any of these kind of things. You really need to find the folks in your church that have good connections, that have a passion for this, that are maybe an accountant, maybe an attorney, maybe a fundraiser, maybe somebody that does, IRAs, those kind of things. You've got to have those folks on there, because if what you're doing is trying to run it with a group of really great volunteers for the church, and my wife is in charge of 600 of wonderful of those folks, it is not the right foundation board. You're just going to beat your head against the wall.
Yep.
Or you're just going to go blindly along, not doing anything. So.
Yeah.